First things first, if you're wondering why I have my makeup like this, it's simply because I have free will. Second, if you want to get straight into the recaps, here is the timestamp. I will also be putting timestamps in the description of kind of the different segments that I think are relevant. Otherwise, stick around to hear what I have going on because this video is a bit different. So today I'm going to be talking about Ready or Not and The Invitation, and you're like, Jade, why? Because these movies are so alike for different reasons. Like the last video I did my final research paper that I did for one of my classes. And while I was on my trip that I went on, I was thinking of a different video that I could do where I was going over movies, and the final girl movie character type popped into my mind, and I was like, what if I went over two movies where women got into a situation and they had to escape and they ended up escaping in the end, spoiler alert, and I ranked what they did throughout both their movies. And so I chose Ready or Not and The Invitation because they both start with a woman going to a mansion of a rich family. The woman is invited there for different reasons, obviously, and what inevitably these two women find out that they have to basically fight for their lives and escape. That is what these two movies are, with different things screwed in the middle. And I obviously will be going more over that later, but I'll just give you the breakdown of how everything's going to happen. First, I'm going to do a detailed recap of what happens in Ready or Not. Then I'm going to do a detailed recap of what happens in The Invitation. And then after that, I'm going to be doing a list. And what I mean by this is, in my notes that I always have here on my lap, I have created categories that I'm going to be giving these women scores on to see overall who had the better escape plan, who had the better exit, who had the best execution in every single category. So the first category I have is gullibility. I'm not sure that's a real word, but that's why I just said /red flag. And what I mean by that is like, who picked up on the most red flags before they were put into their situation, right? Like, did someone say something and were they not alerted by that and they were still just okay with the situation? Or did they call that person out on whatever was happening, right? How gullible were you in the situations that landed you where you were? My second category I have is initial no. Like, what was your reaction when you found out you were in the situation that you were in? When some character gave you the actual rundown on what is happening that you now know you need to escape, how did you react? What was your first thing that you did? My third category is the exit tactic. So basically this category is like, what plan do you go through and how was the execution? My fourth category is wit. Like, what do you do when you are doing your exit tactic? When you're doing that, what wit do you use to get yourself out of the situation? And then I said the final resolution, like in the final few minutes of the film, final 10 minutes of the film, how do you eventually make your escape? Because again, spoiler alert, both of these women do end up getting out with their lives, and the final resolution, how do they do it? And so those are my categories, but again, we're going to be going through those categories and ranking these women out of 5 based on how I think they did in these categories, and I would love to hear what you have to say in the comment section. I will also be rewarding extra points for different things that I feel like rewarding points for, and I will obviously go more over that later. But yeah, that's basically the breakdown of what is going to be happening and what I'm going to be going through, and so let's get into it. Of course, this is a spoiler warning. If you have not seen either of these films, I'm going to be going in great detail of what goes on in these films, so you've been warned. These films do include people getting X'd. If this is your first time seeing my channel, I say X'd simply because I don't know how YouTube will react to me saying that, so I just say X'd. First, we are going to be starting with Ready or Not, which came out in 2019. I remember this movie, but I don't remember it being then. If you would have asked me, I probably would have said 2021. But our movie starts, I would say, back in the 80s. This is not said that it starts in the 80s in the movie, but I'm saying it kind of starts back in the 80s. And we're introduced to two little boys running through a mansion. One of the boys, whose name is Daniel, is placing his brother Alex in a closet to hide. Right after Daniel places Alex inside the closet, a unnamed man, who I will say his name is Charles, comes up behind Daniel, is basically pleading with Daniel to help him out. And when you look at Charles, you can see that he's been impaled by some sort of object in his side. And instead of helping him, Daniel immediately calls for help. He says, he's in here, he's in here. And at this point, different people in masks basically come into the room. They impale Charles again, and then they drag him into a separate room. While this is happening, a woman named Helene or Helen, it was kind of weird how it was said in the movie. Like, I couldn't tell if they were saying Helen or Helene. So I'm going to be saying, because it's spelled Helene, I'm going to say Helen. But as this is happening, a woman named Helen is basically pleading for this man's life, and she's being held back by the people in the masks. But her pleads do not end up working, and she ends up almost kind of going stone-faced and walking into this unknown room with the people in the masks. And before walking into the room with them, this other woman in a mask takes off her mask and pats Daniel on the back for basically giving up this man's position. Then we were kind of fast forwarded 30 years in the future, and we were introduced to a woman named Grace, who is basically sitting down practicing her vows in front of a mirror. She's also smoking a cigarette as this happens. And then her groom named Alex walks in. This is an older version of Alex from the earlier part of the film. He walks in and they kind of have this like really fun conversation. I feel like this scene is meant to establish that they're kind of like the cool couple or something, or just simply establish their dynamic. In this scene, we also learn that they've only been together for 18 months, and Grace is a bit kind of like iffy because she's like, I don't think your family will like me. I think that they might think I'm a gold digger because we haven't been together for a super long time. And Alex is kind of like, we're gonna have this wedding and then we're dipping and they're not going to see me again. And Alex does this because he does not believe his family are good people, but he doesn't necessarily go into detail as to why he believes that is. Daniel basically interrupts this scene to tell them that it's time to come downstairs, but within this scene, I will highlight that he kind of jokingly says to Grace, it's not too late to back out. And the thing is that also at the end of the scene, after Daniel leaves, Alex really pushes this point home as well. He's like, Grace, I'm serious. It's not too late for you to back out. Grace is like, no, I'm ready to become part of the Ladomus family, which is what their name is. They're the Ladomus family. And then before I carry on, I just want to introduce every single member of the family just so that we can put names to faces before I continue on with the rest of going over the movie. I will also be saying like who married into the family and who was a part of the family. So first we have Helen, and then we have Tony. They are both brother and sister, and they are original Ladomus family members. And then Helen does not have a husband, and Tony is married to Becky, who married into the family. They have 3 kids, and their kids are Alex, Daniel, and then they have a daughter named Emily. And then Emily is married to Fitch, so Fitch married into the family, and together they have 2 kids, 2 sons named Georgie and Gabe. And then Daniel has a wife, her name is Charity, so she married into the family, and they do not have any kids. And then as of right now, Grace is actively marrying into the family with marrying Alex. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so before the actual wedding, there's a scene where they are taking photos. This is where we kind of get a bit more information as to the beginning of the family dynamic. We also get to learn that Alex has not been in contact with his family for 2 years, and they're not happy about that, especially his mother. And then I would say in this scene, we get to know that all the different members of the family are just straight up a-holes to each other, very like snappy at each other and sassy to each other, making all these sly comments. And a lot of them don't like Grace, even though they don't really know her. But Alex and Grace get married, and then we kind of have a jump to later in the night. And Alex basically explains to Grace that at midnight, it is a family tradition that the person who is married into the family plays a game. And he can't necessarily tell her what game it's going to be because he's telling her, like, oh, you pick the game. I don't pick the game. No one else picks the game. At this point, Grace is just kind of being like, I mean, I guess so. It sounds like, if it's a family tradition, it sounds cute or whatever. I want to be a part of the family, which Grace doesn't necessarily have family, which is something that is also a trend with Evie, our main character in the other movie as well. So she's just kind of willing to go along with it. But I made a point here to say that Alex does say to her, it doesn't matter whether she wins or loses the game. The reason he said this, which I will kind of clarify more later, but I just kind of wanted to make a note of this point for when I actually get more into detail of talking about how the game actually works. So when 11:55 hits, the entire family goes into their private game room, and Tony, the father, basically explains the backstory as to why they play these games. And he basically says his great grandfather on a ship made a deal with this man named Mr. LaBelle. And Mr. LaBelle told Tony's great grandfather that if you are able to solve this puzzle box, I will fund any company or anything you want when we make it to land. And he has to solve this puzzle box before they make it to the land. And he ends up doing it, and so Mr. LaBelle sponsors him. And that is how the family is rich now. But this wealth does not come for free, and so Mr. LaBelle wants every single time a new person marries into the family, they play a game. And basically, Tony explains that they put a blank card in the box, in the puzzle box, and then they give it to Grace, and Mr. LaBelle ends up picking the game that Grace is going to play. And so Grace ends up picking hide and seek, and when she announces this to the table of people, there's kind of like this hush that falls over the room, and if you look at everyone's faces, there's kind of just like this, maybe like a fear or just like a dang, out of every single one you picked that one. Which at this point, Grace is still clueless. This is one of the reasons I made the red flag category, because if I picked a game and everyone went hush in the room and then started getting up with scared, almost like apologetic looks on their faces, that would alert me that something is off. But Grace is still kind of clueless, and it's just like, oh, so am I the only one hiding? How is this gonna work? How am I gonna win if everyone's hunting me? Wouldn't you guys just find me? And she is asking these questions to Tony, and he says the way that you can win the game is to not get caught until morning. That's the only way that she can win. And so they put on this record. Everyone goes into the room, and during the scene, we can see everyone getting a weapon. Grace doesn't see this, but everyone is just kind of, as the record is going, playing her countdown for how much time she has to hide. People are getting pew pews, people are getting crossbows. I think Helen grabs like an axe. And by the time the music stops playing, Grace is hiding in the dumbwaiter. The only person who doesn't participate in the hide and seek game is Alex. He actually ends up staying in the game room, and Charity is supposed to guard the game room. But as the countdown happens and, Charity's waiting by the door, Alex ends up going and escaping through one of the servant hallways, which there's servant exits that don't look like normal doors. It kind of be like if there was a panel wall, and then you'd have like a small little thing you can open and get into it, and these are all over the house. But as the music stops and they start to go on the hunt for Grace, you can clearly tell that not everyone is skilled with the weapon. Not everyone knows what they're doing, especially people like Fitch and Emily. Fitch is literally in one scene, he's looking up how to use a crossbow, and Emily is on substances. I'd say the only people who are enthusiastic about it are Charity, Becky, Tony, and Helen. Helen is the top person who is excited to be hunting for Grace. But after a while, Grace sneaks out of the dumbwaiter because she's like, I'm not going to be sitting in this dumbwaiter the entire night of my wedding night. I'm kind of overplaying this game. She still thinks it's just a game, by the way. But as she gets out, there was one of the maids, whose name is Clara, who was watching the two boys, Gabe and Georgie. When Clara comes back in the room to check on them, Georgie is missing. So she ends up coming out of the room because she was just in their bedroom with them, and she's going around the house like looking for Georgie, saying his name. And Grace, remember, she just came out of the dumbwaiter. She hears Clara coming down the hall, so she goes to hide, and then she ends up getting, snatched by Alex and dragged into this room. And Alex is like, I need you to get your stuff, I need you to get your shoes, we are getting out of here. And Clara kind of hears this little bit of commotion, and that causes Alex and Grace to hide behind the bed, and Clara comes in the room still looking for Georgie. And as she leaves to go right back out of the door, she literally gets pew-pewed right in the face by Emily. And at this point, after seeing Clara's body, this is when Grace realizes that this is not a game, because, a lot of the family members come into the room and is like, that's not her. And Emily's like, what? And they're like, you're looking for a woman in a white wedding dress. A blonde woman in a white wedding dress. She's not blonde, and she's not wearing a wedding dress. And you could just see the fear register on her face as she's looking at Alex and being like, what is happening? And then looking at Clara and them talking about hiding her body. And, just overall, this is when she realizes I'm getting hunted. When she finds this out, she's a bit like stunned. And what gets her moving is Alex. Alex pulls her into the servant hallways and is like, we need to get out of here. He helps her take off her heels. He gives her sneakers. She puts on her Converse. And he's like, okay, I need you to stick with me here. Come on, I need you to snap out of it. We need to go because they're trying to hunt you. I'm going to go into the security office and I'm going to unlock the doors and turn off the cameras, and I'm going to need you to go to the kitchen. Also, during this little meeting they have, Alex is just kind of like, you picked the one bad card, and now my family believes that they have to X you before sunrise or something bad is going to happen to the entire family. And then they split up, and Alex starts heading to the security cameras, and Grace starts heading towards the kitchen. But as soon as Grace gets out of the servant quarters, she opens the door and goes into the hallway, and then right here is Helen and I believe Tony dragging Clara's body, and then over here is Emily. And Emily tries to take another shot at her, and that causes everyone to duck, and that just gives Grace time to escape. Grace runs into the study having ran away from Emily, Tony, and Helen, and Daniel walks in and they make eye contact, and Daniel kind of looks at her and then goes to sit on the couch. And he's like, I have to tell them where you are. And she's like, please don't. He's like, I'll give you a 10-second head start. And so he gives her a 10-second head start, and that's where she actually starts to make her way to the kitchen. Once Daniel alerts everyone that she's in the study, which she's not, they kind of have this other conversation, and at this point they're kind of getting a bit worried because I guess they figured they would have found her a bit faster than they actually have. And so they're all in the study talking, and Emily realizes that she forgot her pew pew, and so Fitch, her husband, offers to let her borrow his crossbow. And in this exchange, as he is actually actively handing the crossbow over to her, another one of the maids walks in, and Emily accidentally ends up shooting a bow straight through the maid's mouth. And so at this point, they're kind of like, Emily, it's not your fault. It's just like, calm down. We're all kind of freaked out here. And Daniel and Tony go and head to the security room because they're about to turn back on the cameras. Originally, when they were saying the game and the game rules, they stressed to Grace that they're not going to be able to see her on the cameras because they wanted to play it the way that Mr. LaBelle would have played it back in his day. But at this point, they're kind of like bending the rules because again, they're scared that they're not going to be able to find Grace by daylight. Before Grace gets to the kitchen, she makes a stop at the game room and grabs a pew pew and some ammunition, and then she heads to the kitchen where she comes into contact with the butler. At the same exact time, in the security room, Alex is able to disarm the doors, the windows, and at this point, that means that Grace can open them and get access to the outside world. But as she is in the kitchen, again, she runs into the butler named Mr. Stevens, and they kind of have this little fight. She ends up being able to escape him by throwing hot water in his face and running out of the kitchen because he was blocking the kitchen door, so she couldn't have that exit anymore. And again, back in the control room, after disarming the system, Alex basically takes a fire extinguisher and smashes the cameras and the control board so that no one can rearm the system. And Tony and Daniel also end up breaking into the room, and a little kersnuffle happens, and Tony ends up knocking out Alex because the reason they were guarding him is so that he could not help Grace, and he escaped to help Grace, and so he's kind of actively working against them. So they end up taking him to a bedroom and handcuffing him to the bed. At this point, Grace tries to go back to the dumbwaiter, and as she's at the dumbwaiter, she opens it and the last maid is in there. This maid's name is Dora. And Grace is like, look, they're not looking for you. They're looking for me. So please let me hide in the dumbwaiter. And this is when the maid starts screaming, she's over here. She's over here. And as she leans forward, she ends up triggering, I think, a mechanism inside the dumbwaiter. So the dumbwaiter closes on her and basically crushes her. And so this prompts Grace to run outside, and she ends up heading into the goat stables. I don't know if it has a different name, but like where the goats are being held. They don't have horses, they have goats. And in the stable, she ends up running into Georgie. And at this point, she's kind of like, oh, okay, Georgie, look, I need help. I know this is going to sound weird, but before she can actually explain her situation to him, Georgie ends up taking a pew pew, and a pew pew ammunition goes straight through her hand. And of course, out of pain and shock, she ends up punching this kid in the face, which I'm not gonna say too much on that one. That doesn't end up knocking him out. She also, while in the goat pen, ends up falling into the goat pit. And the reason I mention this, because she does end up getting out, but the reason I mention it is because there were other bodies down there, which kind of for us, I would say, lets us know that this is not obviously the first time, as we know because of the beginning scene of the movie. But I think she ends up finding a already decomposed body, and I think it was the body of Charles. But Grace is able to make it to the edge of the property. She's able to make it out of the fence, but now the butler, Mr. Stevens, is after her in a car. He's angry because, of course, she's burned half his face. As he corners her and like grabs her, she's able to knock him out and steal the car, and this is a victory for her. But it doesn't end up lasting long because she tries to use the car's like intelligence system to call the police, but the person on the system ends up saying that the car is stolen, so he locks the car down, which allows Mr. Stevens to have enough time to catch up to her and break the glass window, knock her out, and ends up taking her back to the house. But this doesn't end up working because she ends up, hitting Mr. Stevens. She causes him to crash the car, which takes him out of the situation. And so she's able to get out of the car and start to escape. But then she runs into Daniel again. And she's over here pleading with Daniel to be like, hey, look, I know you're better than this. Alex wouldn't want this. You love Alex. He's your brother. But Daniel ends up getting close to her and knocking her out, and Daniel and Tony end up taking her back to the house. When Grace wakes up, she is strapped to a ritual table, and she's kind of just looking around, and the family is in cloaks. They're muttering something, and then they all take a swig from this like big fancy cup. And right as Tony is about to take his, I feel like I could say dagger on YouTube. I feel like that's fine. Right as he's about to take his dagger and, plunge it in, he kind of like topples over in pain and starts like throwing up, and so does the rest of the family except Daniel. At this point, Daniel starts to untie her from the table. Tony's like, what did you put in the drink? And basically Daniel ends up poisoning them with hydrochloric acid and freeing Grace from the table to help her escape for Alex's sake, because throughout this movie you can kind of tell that Alex and Daniel have, I would say, a bit of a rocky relationship, but still a good relationship. But as they're in the hallway, Daniel and Grace get cornered by Charity, Daniel's wife, and Charity's like, look, I need you to get out the way because I need to take her back. And Daniel is like, no, because throughout the movie you can tell that they don't necessarily like each other. I'm not even going to speak on that, but Charity ends up pew-pewing Daniel in the neck, and Grace ends up running away after checking on Daniel, but there's nothing she can do. That's a neck wound. She can't do anything about that. And her life is still at risk because Charity was trying to get to her. So she ends up knocking Charity out, I should say that. And then she ends up running away. And as she runs away and she's in a different room, this is when Alex is able to have freed himself, because this entire time he's kind of just been like sawing with his handcuffs at the wooden bedpost. So he's able to get free, and he ends up coming across Daniel right as he is passing, and Daniel passes in Alex's arms. But Grace does not get a break, because the next room she runs into, she ends up getting into a fight with Becky. Again, that's Alex and Daniel's mom, Tony's wife. And at the end of the scene, as Grace is being choked out by Becky, she's able to pull the puzzle box off the table and hit Becky with it enough times for her to no longer be in the land of the living. And Alex actually witnesses this. He actually comes in on the tail end of Grace hitting Becky, and he kind of has this moment with Grace. They don't say this in the movie, but I think that Alex thinks that Grace exed Daniel. They don't say that, but I think he thinks that, right? Because in the next moment, as he's like getting close to her, he actually just grabs her and alerts the family that she's in this room. And so at this point, they're all kind of scared because they say the sun is getting closer and closer to getting in the sky. And so instead of doing it in their normal ritual room, they end up just putting Grace on the table and trying to do the ritual then. And at this point, everyone is just helping to hold Grace down, and Alex is the one holding the dagger, and they're all saying the chant. And then Alex is about to plunge the dagger in, and Grace is able to move, and the dagger ends up going into her shoulder instead of into her heart. And at this point, everyone kind of just lets her go, and she takes the dagger out of her shoulder and kind of just goes into a corner and starts trying to protect herself. And Aunt Helen is about to go at her, but then she looks out the window and sees that the sun has come up, and so she opens it. And when she opens it, everyone just starts to cower and kind of look around, because again, they thought that something bad was going to happen if they were not able to X Grace before the sun came up. And so the sun is up now, and so as they're standing there kind of like waiting for something to happen, nothing happens. And so they're like, oh, the curse wasn't real. So what are we going to do about Grace? And then Helen is like, we still need to X her. And then she tries to go at Grace with an axe, and then she just explodes. And then back to back to back, all the family members start to explode. Fitch, then it goes Charity, then it goes Emily and her two kids. They kind of like pop, pop, pop. Sorry. Then Tony, and then the last person now standing is Alex. And as everyone is starting to like pop like fireworks, Grace is kind of just looking around and is laughing at all of this. And again, Alex is the last one, and Grace looks at him and he looks at Grace, and Grace starts to walk away. And he's like, wait, I didn't mean any of that. You know, I'm scared. My family got to me. And Grace is like, no. And so she takes off her ring and is like, I want a divorce, and throws the ring at him. And the minute she throws the ring at him, he explodes. And then she sees Mr. LaBelle in the chair, and he kind of nods at her. And earlier in the night, I forget how or who did it. I think it was Grace, but I think she accidentally knocked over a candle or something. So at this point, the house has been on fire for a little bit, because as she is exiting the house, the entire house is on fire at this point. She is sitting on the back steps of the house, a bit stunned by what is happening. She's covered in blood, and she just ends up sitting on the steps, pulls out a cigarette, and she starts smoking as the police pull up and ask her what happened. And the last thing she says when the police ask her what happens is, in-laws. Moving straight into the next movie. The next movie we have is The Invitation, which I believe, because I didn't write it down, it came out in 2022. I'll correct myself right here if I'm wrong. If there's nothing there, then that's correct. But our movie starts again in another big mansion, and we get to see this woman in this very big empty room, and a butler behind a locked door, I should say, is telling her that she needs to eat, that it's been a while since she's eaten, and she needs to eat. This is not healthy for her. But the woman refuses, and this prompts the butler to open the door to like have a conversation with her. And as he opens the door, she like walks up on him and throws him. And when I say throws him, I'm not talking about like a gently pushes him and is able to run past him. This woman literally throws this fully grown man out of the way. She ends up escaping to a different room. We don't know what room this is, but this room has a piano in it, and she looks at the piano strings, and what ends up happening is she takes a piano string, wraps it around her neck. She takes one of the busts in the hallway, and with the bust in her hand, she says, and I quote, "It all ends here with me." And then she jumps off the banister. Then we jump to New York City. That was happening in Britain. They don't say that, but that was the last scene was happening in Britain. But we jump to New York City, and we're following a woman who, I'll just say her name is Evie, as she is catering an event, or one of the servers during a catered event. Once the event is over and Evie and her friend are in the back room just kind of having a fun, cute little chat. Through this chat, we find out that her friend is in college. I don't believe Evie's in college. She might be. It's kind of like iffy, but she's around that age, I should say. But at the end of the conversation, her friend ends up giving her one of the goodie bags from the event, and the event was one of those fancy corporate events where they try to sell you a product, and the product they were trying to sell was DNA tests. And so in the goodie bag was like wine, a few other little gifts, and a DNA test. Then we cut to Evie back home in her New York apartment. In this scene, she's kind of like on the pottery wheel, and we find out that she does not have any more family like Grace. She has no family because her mother recently passed from cancer, and her father passed when she was 14. And so, you know, she's on her own, and on a whim, she decides to sign up for the website and take the DNA test and send in her results. On a different day, she's back in her apartment. Her friend is there. She decides to check her email, and she notices that she has gotten an email from a cousin that she's related to, and he's from England, and his name is Oliver, and he's wanting to meet her. And so Evie agrees to it, and they end up meeting in this sort of like hotel cafe, I would say. I don't know. It kind of looked like she walked into a hotel and went to one of the restaurants in the hotel. And I like actually quoted this part because I wanted to relay the story that Oliver told Evie in detail because of points I plan on making later. So Oliver says to Evie, because Evie is black, she's a black woman, but I say that because Oliver and her are related, and he half explains the story as how they're related because she is black and he is white. And he basically says, and I quote, "You're part of the family's scandal. Just before her nuptials in 1925, your great-great-grandmother, Emmeline, had an illicit affair with a footman, And then Evie is like, a black footman? And Oliver's like, well, evidently. But basically, Oliver says that she had, again, a baby and kept it a secret from the entire family. Emmeline didn't keep the baby necessarily. She let the man she had an affair with take the baby and raise the baby on his own. And that baby, again, is Evie's grandfather. But Oliver basically tells her that the entire Alexander family, which is what their family line is called, knows about her and is excited to meet her and wants to meet her. And then he's like, oh wait, in a few weeks we have a wedding coming up for our cousin Martin and his wife Cecile. You should totally come out and celebrate with us. And Evie's kind of like, oh no, I do not have the money to be flying over to England. And he's like, well, we'll sponsor it. And she's like, no. And he's like, well, I mean, family wants to meet you, so we'll completely pay for it. It's fine. And so Evie does at this point end up agreeing to it. And I will highlight this one part as she's in the airport in Britain and she's talking to her friend, and her friend go over the precautions that they have to take. And again, I'm mentioning this for the later list. The precautions they have is Evie is supposed to send a picture of the license plate. She's supposed to text her friend when she goes to sleep, and don't trust men in goatees with goatees. Those are their rules. But Oliver meets her at the airport and they end up driving to a mansion, and the mansion is owned by the DeVille family. The mansion is called New Carfax Abbey. When Evie arrives, she gets out the car and she's about to take a picture of the license plate, but as she is taking the picture, she ends up bumping into one of the maids. Again, more maids, and making her drop the plates. The maid's name is Dia, but she also goes by D, so I'll be calling her D. And she also ends up running into Imogen as well. Evie ends up helping them pick up the up the cups, and this kind of like makes them a little bit more buddy. And as this is happening, a butler named Mr. Fields kind of walks up and is scolding them for dropping the glasses, and Evie is like, it was my fault, I ran into her. And they kind of have like a small sassy exchange, and Walter comes to break it up and diffuse the situation. And he's like, Mr. Fields, she's one of our important guests. And Evie's like, well, does it matter if I'm important or not? Basically insinuating like, it doesn't matter whether I'm important. Why is he talking to them like that? Which I also agree with. But then Oliver also comes up to the situation and he's like, well, let me formally introduce you to the Lord of the Manor, Walter DeVille. And at this point, Evie kind of softens a little bit and is like, oh, you own this. Okay. My fault. She doesn't say it like that, but she's kind of like, she softens up a little bit and is like, thank you for letting me stay at your house. And he's like, there's no problem with it. And then Mr. Fields ends up showing her around the mansion. He tells her that she has free range, free access to go anywhere except the library because it's under renovation. He also introduced her to her maid that will be tending to her throughout her duration of the trip, and the maid's name is Mrs. Swift. A little bit of time goes by, and at this point, Evie has settled into her bedroom and she is talking to her friend about the events of the day, and she gets a knock on the door, and it ends up being Walter at the door, which I'll call him Walt because that's kind of what he goes by for the rest of the film. And Walt kind of comes up to the door and is like, look, I feel like we got off on the wrong foot earlier. I would like to apologize for how Mr. Fields was talking to you, and I would like us to meet on better terms. And so this like cute little exchange ends up happening, and Evie really respects him for apologizing, like actually coming up to her and apologizing for the events that happened. And then she ends up going on a night run, not with him, by herself, but she tells her friend, I'm going on a night run. And the reason I mention this is because I'm not sure what part of this scene is real and what part of the scene is a dream, because as she is out on this run, she ends up looking up back at the mansion and sees a woman standing in a window, and this woman is saying, it ends with me, it ends with me. And then Evie wakes up from the dream. So I think the run was real because she did tell her friend she was going on a run, but when she wakes up, she ends up leaving her room and going to find water. And as she is out in the hallway, she looks down from the banister and sees that Mr. Fields is with all the maids. And all these maids, not all of them are necessarily named. On their uniforms, they have like a number embroidered into their uniform from 1 to 5. And he basically is standing there in front of the library door with the maids. And then, as you know, like old mansions have like that system where you can like pull a lever and then a bell is rung, and so so that person can see like what room rung that bell. And so 2 rings come from the library bell, and so that prompts Mr. Fields to tell maid number 2 to go in and clean the library. And Evie is witnessing all of this, and as she is looking at it, we can kind of see something creeping up behind her, and it's about to touch her, and she turns around and there's nothing there. And then when she turns back, Mrs. Swift is in front of her, and of course that scares Evie. But Mrs. Swift kind of just tells her, you shouldn't be out this late, you shouldn't be outside of your bedroom at night, which to me would be a red flag. But she takes Evie back to her bedroom, and then we get up with Evie the next morning. And the next morning, a family reunion is happening. Remember, we came to this mansion because a wedding is supposed to be happening. Just keep that in mind for the rest of the events I'm about to tell you. But a family reunion for the Alexander family is happening, and Evie ends up showing up, and everyone is so happy to see her. One of her uncles, great uncles, says, and I quote, "So many boys, we thought we were done for." I say that quote for later. Remember it. But he gives his speech while saying that quote, and then they all look at Evie, and she's like, oh, I'm supposed to say something now? And then she says kind of like a little thank you to everyone else as well. And then we cut to a scene where Dee, oh my gosh, I forgot to say, when the maid was in the library, she ends up getting snatched by something within the library, and I do not know if the maid who got snatched was Imogen, because 2 of them kind of low-key look alike. I'm gonna be respectfully, they looked alike, so I couldn't tell if that was Imogen or the woman in this next scene was Imogen. But Dee goes down to the cellar with maid, and her number was 4, and they are tasked with bringing a wine up for the event that is going to be happening. And during this scene, basically maid number 4 gets snatched from behind, and Dee also gets snatched. Then we cut back to Evie in her bedroom, and she ends up seeing a dress posted on the 4-post of her bed, and it ends up being a gift from Walter for her to wear to the event later in the night. And this ends up being kind of like a party, and Evie of course wears the dress, and she walks through this kind of like archway, and as she walks through, she gets introduced as Evelyn Alexander, her full name, which is Evelyn, but her last name isn't Alexander. I believe her last name is Jackson, but everyone keeps calling her Alexander. And then a little bit later, the maids of honor, or the maidens of honor, get introduced. There's 2 of them, and they're named Victoria Klopstop and Lucy Billington. And Lucy and Victoria immediately introduce themselves to Evie, and Victoria right away is very mean to Evie, making comments about her American accent and her, not necessarily her looks, but just not being a very nice person to Evie. And Lucy is a bit more nice to Evie and a bit more welcoming. But at this one point, Evie asks Lucy and Victoria, so how do you guys know the couple? How do you guys know Cecile? And Lucy kind of pauses for a second as like she's confused, and then it isn't until Evie says, how do you know Cecile? And then she says the bride. Then that's when Lucy's able to answer. I'm just pointing these things out because then Walt shows up, and he walks through the gates. Everyone who seems to walk through the archway gets an introduction. And immediately as Walt walks through the archway, he looks around, and once he sees Evie, he makes a beeline to Evie. And I mean, like, nothing in between. He didn't even care about the introduction. He didn't care about the people clapping. He said, "Where is she?" and went straight to her. And then without a hesitation, he goes to her, pulls her to the dance floor, and they start dancing, and people are just watching him. What does this sound like to y'all? What does it sound like? Because to me, the first dance, he says, I always do the first dance. Okay, but most of the time when people are doing a first dance at someone else's wedding, it is the couple. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to it later. But as they are on the dance floor, everyone else is watching, and then of course everyone else starts to join them on the dance floor. But after a little while, the scene where Victoria is talking to Oliver, and in this mini scene, Victoria congratulates Oliver on bringing a female Alexander. But anyways, Walt and Evie leave the dance floor, and they go into this room that kind of looks like an art studio, and they kind of have this cute interaction again, and they end up kissing for the first time. And then we cut to a little bit later, and Evie is in her bed. She's awoken, and something from above, she has like one of those, again, those 4-post bed that kind of have the things draping down, so there's a top to it, and she sees like these hands on the top, and she gets scared and she crawls under the bed, and then something pulls her from under the bed, but when she looks, it's just Walt. And what ends up happening is that she's scared because she's literally seeing hands with claws on the top of her bed. And so Walt offers to stay in the room, stay in the bed with her until she's able to fall asleep. So then they have a cute little talk, then growing their relationship. And then she ends up falling asleep and he ends up leaving after she's fallen asleep for the night. But she gets awoken the next morning by Victoria and Lucy saying they're going for a spa day. All the maids are going for a spa day. And during this spa day, it's, Evie and Lucy are kind of getting their nails done and they're having a nice conversation. And Victoria is swimming naked in the pool, just kind of making sassy comments as this is happening. And Victoria just keeps saying things like, how much do you know about Walt? You don't even really know him. What can you say? Like all these different things. And Evie's like, from her perspective, she's just starting to get to know this man. She's, beginnings of a relationship. She's not necessarily thinking of anything serious. She's like, I don't care about his past. I have a past too. Different things like that. And then at the end of the scene, she ends up getting clipped by the nail tech and Victoria sucks the blood off of her finger, which another red flag, but I'll keep going. Of course, getting her after the Victoria situation, Evie, I would go to wash my hands. If someone put their saliva on my finger, I would go to wash my hands. But Evie does end up walking off and leaving the room, and she ends up sneaking into the library. And as she's in there, she ends up finding a folder with paperwork on her website information that she had put on the website, and also her criminal record, not necessarily completely where she exactly lives, but like just her background. Like it's a background check on her. And of course, she does the smart thing and she goes to pack up. Like she's packing up as Walt enters the room and he's like, what is happening? And she throws the paper at him. Well, she throws it on the floor, not at him, but I would have said throw it at him. But she throws the paper and tells him, that's why I'm leaving. And he's like, wait a minute, hold on. And she's like, no. And she confronts him, which I applaud her for. But Walt basically ends up saying, look, I don't like computers and stuff, so Oliver sent that information to me. When he asked me to let you sleep in my house, I needed to do a background check because I'm a rich person. I'm a very rich man, and I've been taken advantage of in the past for my kindness and for my money. So I needed to make sure for my protection you were safe to allow in my house. Evie does insinuate, you're looking at my criminal record. Really? Is it because of how I look? She does say that, right? And he's like, don't insinuate that. But in a very British way. I wish I wrote down like the actual line. Sorry, I hit the camera. I wish I'd wrote down the actual lines. But yeah, like I'm stressing because I'm happy that she confronts him, because I feel like that's not something a lot of people do in movies. Confront them. Anyways, she ends up falling for it was for my protection thing. They end up sleeping together, and afterwards he jokingly proposes to her and she's like, what? And he's like, well, the arrangements are already here. Our family is already here. Mind you, this girl met these people a few days ago, but I digress. We can just have a double wedding, a shotgun wedding. And Evie jokingly says, fine, I accept your proposal. Well, she just says, I accept. And then Walt just happily gets out of the bed, and Evie's like, wait, I was joking, right? And he just smiles at her. He just smiles and leaves. The next event was happening later that night, and this was the rehearsal dinner. Evie ends up showing up late, but the rehearsal dinner is kind of happening in this, I would honestly say the table is large, but this room is very tight. And Evie ends up sitting at the edge or the end of the table with Walt, like double chairs, them two at the end of the table, and then everybody else. And there's not another chair at the end of that table. That is a red flag. But I'll continue. So she ends up sitting at the end of the table with Walt. And Walt stands up to give a speech. And in this speech, he's thanking the Billington family for being there. He's thanking the Klopstop family for being there. And he is thanking the Alexander family for being at this event. And then they begin to feast. And then Evie is just kind of sitting there and she's like, where's the bride and groom? And instead of answering that question, Walt just goes, and then he stands up again and he starts to give another speech. And within this speech, he reveals that him and Evie are the bride and groom. And then he calls for refreshments to make a toast. And this prompts Mr. Fields to one of the maids hold her head and let it just drain into a bowl. That's as much detail as I can give you. And Evie is just kind of sitting there stunned. Mrs. Swift is standing in the corner. There's guards behind Mr. Fields and there's guards at the door. And everyone else is acting like this is normal. But Walt continues to give a speech. And during this speech, he reveals that for centuries, the Klopstops, the Billingtons, and the Alexanders have provided him with wives. Always 3 wives. We also find out that Victoria and Lucy are 2 of his wives. And he thanks the Alexanders for being able to provide him with another Alexander wife after the first Alexander wife unfortunately left them. That Alexander wife was in fact the woman at the beginning of the movie who ended up throwing herself off the banister. And basically Evie is there to replace the woman who was her great-great-grandmother, Emmeline. Remember, Emmeline. Evie is there to replace Emmeline as the Alexander bride. And at this point, in kind of like a half daze, Evie stands up and starts to slowly make her way to the door. And as she is about to leave, the guards stand in front of it. And she just kind of turns around and looks at everyone and is like, I need to go. Y'all need to let me go. And that prompts Walt to come up to the door and being like, baby, you're embarrassing me. And I'm thinking, she doesn't know you. Anyways, it's just you have, if you have not seen the movie, you need to watch it because it's crazy. This man is crazy. I applaud, I don't know the actor's name, but I applaud his performance. Crazy. But he ends up saying to Victoria and Lucy, he's like, you guys have her first tonight for the bachelorette party, and then I will have her tomorrow for the wedding. And so Evie does get taken down to the cellar, and she is tied to a chair as Lucy and Victoria are down there. Might I also say, they drank the blood. I don't think I mentioned that, but yeah, they drink the blood. Victoria has fangs, Lucy has fangs, he has fangs, and he calls everyone mortals. I also want to stress that he needs 3 wives because if everyone gives him 3 wives, he is able to give them safety and prosperity. But Victoria fills us in on a bit more of the lore, and she basically says that their 3 bloodlines are rare, and once their bloodlines are joined, that gives them the powers of immortality. Or she more so says it makes them immune to the effects of time. And, you know, of course Evie is freaking out and Victoria's being very relaxed and Lucy is in front of Evie trying to like calm her down. She's like, I was in your position once too. It's actually not that bad, and you know, we really did love your great grandmother, and you know, you'll be one of our friends and you'll get used to it. Lucy also mentions that Victoria has been with Walt for 500 years and Lucy herself has only been with Walt for 100 years. And she also explains the parameters of the ceremony, basically saying that during the ceremony, Evie will be bound to Walt, just like Victoria and Lucy are. And how this bond works is to make the bond permanent, she must consume his blood, and then this will allow her to gain his strength and his power and become like him and be strong. But the ceremony isn't complete until Walt drinks her blood, and then that will give all of them eternal life. And then at this moment, Dee is revealed to be alive. If you remember, she got taken in the basement, and I thought she was originally X'd, but she was in fact alive. And Victoria is about to drain her, but she ends up stopping when Evie is like, don't drain her. And she's like, oh, you've taken a liking to her. And then Evie's just like, yeah. And so they're like, prepare her for the ceremony tomorrow so she can be her first drink. And then at the end of the scene, Victoria basically just throws Evie in a coffin for the rest of the night. And then we are prompted to Evie trying to escape the coffin, and she's not able to escape it herself. She ends up seeing the light of day by a crowbar that Mrs. Swift is using to open the coffin. And Mrs. Swift basically tries to help her escape. And the reasoning she gives for this is because she said she absolutely loved Evie's great grandmother and they were really good friends. And then Mrs. Swift also, before leaving Evie to escape, tells her that the only way that you can X them is by stake, beheading, or by fire. And so Evie makes a run for it, running straight into the ice box, which was kind of like, it kind of looks like a garden house, except it was a refrigerator before refrigerators were refrigerators. And when she gets in here, she ends up seeing all the dead maids that were at the beginning of the movie, just all of them on top of blocks of ice. And she hears someone trying to come into the ice box, so she gets under the table and a body is placed right on the ice above her. She looks and it is Mrs. Swift. She is able to escape the ice box, trapping Mr. Fields inside, and she's able to make it to a nearby town where she runs into an older couple. She goes into the older couple's home and they offer her tea and they make a phone call. And during this scene, Evie discovers a picture on the wall. It is a picture of the woman and the man, the couple at the mansion, in a picture with Mr. Fields. And they keep on trying to stress to Evie to drink her chamomile tea. And at the end of the scene, Evie throws the chamomile in the man's face, and before she's able to escape, the woman knocks her out. When she awakes, she is laying on Dee's lap in the library. Dee is weak. She is weak. She sits up and sees Walt sitting in an armchair across from them. He kind of applauds her on her attempt. He's also a bit smug because obviously she's back here, but then that prompts Evie to ask him what he actually is, and he's very sassy with his answers. Like every time Evie asks him a question, he's like, wait a minute, and then he does something and then he answers the question. Like I mentioned at the dinner, she's like, where's the bride and groom, and he's like, hold on, and then right here she's like, what are you, and he's like, wait, and he puts a record on and then he answers the question. And he basically says that like in his time, in the olden days, they were called the Strigoi, they were called Nosferatu, or he said one of his favorite names that they were called was the Son of Dragons. And Walt continues to try and reason with her. He's like, I don't know why you'd want to escape. You know, being my wife is not a bad thing. You'll have status, you'll have money, you'll have privilege. And then he also says, and I quote, for someone of your background, and he says it like this, I'll try to recreate kind of how he says it. He's like, for someone of your background, this is surely a leg up. Now, if you don't understand what this means, I'll give you the cultural context. He is not saying this because she is poor and not being able to pay her bills in New York. He's saying because she looked like me, this must be a leg up for her. And she spits in his face, as she should. But I will say, he kind of does eat her up because he uses her hand to wipe the spit off of his face. Sassy. That's not funny, but I'm just like, that's the way to do it. If someone spits in your face, use their hand to like wipe it off. That's crazy. I'm sorry. I'm gonna continue. But he says regardless of whether she likes it or not, she agreed to the proposal. When, you know, earlier in the scene when she jokingly said I accept, he was saying, you know, that was her agreeing to marrying him. And she's like, no, that was a joke. And he said, well, lucky for me, the rules are loose. And then Evie passes out, and then we cut to her walking down the aisle. And then she kneels next to Walt, and she basically plays along and says yes. She doesn't say I do, she just simply says yes. And then she drinks Walt's blood, gaining his strength, fangs, and nails. And then before Walt can drink her blood to complete the ceremony, she acts like she's thirsty and goes over to Dee to act like she's about to drink her blood, when in fact she swipes all the candles off the kind of display that was behind her, starting a fire. She frees Dee and then incites chaos and panic, and all the party guests start to leave the party. She has this moment with Oliver where Oliver's like, wait, and then she's like, you really want to play with me? She doesn't say that, but she like, you know, hisses at him because now she has fangs, and then he ends up leaving. Walt also goes to stand up and attack her, and Evie takes one of the candlesticks, like things that hold the candles, and you know, they have a sharp point so that when you put the candle on it, they stay. She uses one of those and she drives it into him. And with Walt is Victoria and Lucy, and they're kind of holding him as this happens, and they're like screaming no. Well, it's more Victoria who's screaming no versus Lucy. But Evie and Dee are escaping down the hall, but they are getting chased by Victoria. And Victoria and Evie start fighting, but remember, Evie now has the same powers as Victoria. Of course, she's not as skilled with the powers as Victoria is, but they're fighting, and as Victoria has Evie pinned up against the wall, Lucy kind of scratches her to get her attention, so that prompts Victoria to throw Evie across the room and turn her attention to Lucy, and they kind of have this moment, and Lucy finally stands up for herself. I feel like this might be one of the first times she stand up for herself within the past 100 years that she's been with Victoria and with Walt, and they're fighting, and what ends up happening is Lucy ends up pushing them both into a part of a sculpture that had a spear on it, and so they're both impaled by this sculpture and they end up passing away. But I should also say that during the fight Evie was having with Victoria, Victoria was also expressing the same emotions that Walt was expressing, calling her things like halfling or beneath them. And same thing happens with Mr. Fields. As she runs into an office to get away, she ends up getting chased after by Mr. Fields, and he is saying things like, I told Walt, you aren't worth it, you're below our standards. And we know why they're saying these things. Let's not try to beat around the bush. Evie ends up also Mr. Fields as well, and then she leaves the room. And at this point, girl doesn't get a break. She is now being chased by Walt, who, mind you, is crawling up the walls. So I feel like that's the scariest way someone could come at you, honestly, on the ceiling. And at this point, a lot of the house is on fire. Same with happening in the first movie. And the fire is surrounding them. They're kind of like in the main atrium of the house. And Evie has a face-to-face now, a face-off with Walt, who at this point, because he was stabbed, and I think because the ritual was only half completed, he is looking older. And he's kind of holding Evie up by the neck. And she grabbed a weapon when she was in the room with Mr. Fields. So she is able to cut off Walt's hand, and then she pushes him into the fire. And this does end up Xing him. And the reason she knows it does is because the only reason she had her powers was because he was alive. But after she pushed him in the fire, her powers went away, meaning that he is over. He is done for. And then she walks out of the house that has been consumed by the flames. Then 2 weeks go by and we see Oliver back in New York on the phone. He is saying things on the phone like, they need to take out Evie, and he goes into kind of like this building, and across the street is Evie and her friend, and they have plans to take out Oliver. And as the movie ends, they are walking over to the office Oliver just went into to take him out. Now, getting into our categories, I'll be ranking these women both out of 5. Like, the most points they can receive for each category is 5, and the least points they can receive is 1. So the first category, again, is gullibility, which I know might not be a real word, and red flags. Starting with Grace, her red flags, I feel like they both had a lot of red flags that they both ignored. But specifically for Grace, if someone is stressing that you have an out, like you could get out of this situation, 2 people, right? Daniel says it first. He says it in a joking way, so I understand not being able to pick up on that one. But Alex pulls you to the side, is serious with you, and is like, look, you do not have to do this. If someone is stressing that to me, I would take that as a red flag, especially if we've only been together for 18 months. And then another thing that I feel like she should have picked up on was a red flag is everyone's reactions when she drew the game hide and seek. I don't know. I just feel like she should have been able to feel the energy shift in the room. And if not feel the energy shift, everyone went quiet and everyone had kind of like worried looks on their face. If this is their tradition and they look worried, that should have set off red alarm bells in your mind. And then also when everyone is still at this point kind of like not acting normal and you're asking your husband's father, how do I win the game? And he's like, oh, well, you just have to hide till dawn. That's a red flag. At this point, you're still thinking it's a simple game. Why do I have to hide till dawn to survive, or not survive at this point, because she doesn't know that, to win the game? Why is the game going on that long? Those are the red flags to me that I feel like she didn't pick up on. And I feel like if she had picked up on them, she would have been in a different situation. So for this category, I'm honestly going to give her 3. For Evie's red flags, there was a lot for her as well. First of all, maybe it's just me, but I'm not that inclined to go to a different country to meet people I don't know, even if they are family. I understand the thing that was driving them both to these situations was the fact that they did not have any family. And so Evie, having lost her mom months before, was wanting that again. So I completely understand maybe taking for the moment trip and going over to England to possibly meet new family and make new connections with people you're related to. But at the same exact time, not once during this trip did you see the couple. And I feel like that is the biggest red flag in your face. I understand maybe you're thinking, oh, they do things a bit differently over here, but a wedding is about a couple. No one is partying without the couple. In every event you've been to, you haven't seen the couple. No one's mentioned the couple. Another red flag should have been when you mentioned the couple to Lucy, you mentioned the bride's name to Lucy, and Lucy acted like she didn't know who the bride was. And another thing is when you found those papers on the man's desk. I understand that maybe his excuse would have seemed valid, but I still would have gotten out of there and possibly went home or went to a hotel. Because even if it's like, okay, I understand you do that for everyone who's coming into your house, I'm not staying in your house after that. I'm not staying in your house after that. After I find that, I'm leaving. So I would also say she gets a 3. They both get a 3 because those were red flags that neither of them picked up on before they made it to the next part, the initial no. So for Grace, the initial no for her, to refresh your brains, is when the maid Clara got pew-pewed, not necessarily right in front of her, but in the same room as her, and she finds out, oh, this is not a game no more. They're actually hunting me. I'll give Grace a 2, and I'll give Evie a 2.5, and the reason I'm saying that is because after initially finding out, what ends up moving Grace is her husband versus Evie. What ends up moving her is herself, because after finding out that she is the bride and the groom, after seeing the maid get used as juice, she does get up. She again is stunned like Evie, but she still does bring herself up and try to make an escape. So again, Grace is getting a 2, Evie's getting a 2.5. The exit tactic, I feel like we have more to go off of with Grace's exit. The exit tactic, because her exit tactic is practically the entire bread and butter of the movie, and I would say she does a pretty good job. Once she gets out of that initially stunned stage, she puts a move on it. The first thing she does is she grabs a weapon. Of course, that weapon does not end up working for her, but she grabs a weapon and is ready to go. At every single turn, she is helping herself. She is going after the butler. She is running away. She is fighting off children. You know, these hands are rated E for everyone. She is pleading with people that she thinks is going to help her, but then once she realizes these people, none of these people are going to help her, she's putting in the work for herself. So I would definitely say Grace's ET, I can't say it anymore, it's too hard, is a 5. Evie, on the other hand, she has a little bit less space because all her exit tactic happens towards the final 30 minutes of the film, and going based off of that, when it comes to the ET, I'm going to have to put Evie a little bit lower, but not that much lower, because once Evie finds out, she has her stunned moment, but she is still thinking on her feet. She tells Victoria that she wants D, not because she actually wants to drink D, but because she wants to save her, even when she is stunned, even when she is strapped to a chair. Actually, that goes into wit, so I'll talk more about that later. But the minute she's put into the coffin, I would say that's the initial moment. She starts trying to get herself out, and then once she is helped by Mrs. Swift, she promptly runs to the icebox, and then she runs to a village. I would say I would have to deduct points on her because Mrs. Swift told her to not stop running until she makes it to an airport. And the first thing she does is when she gets into the town is stops at the wrong house. And then she ends up getting caught again, but she's able to play along enough to be able to make her broad and escape and get out the same way that Grace was able to get out. But I'm still, again, going to have to deduct points from her because she didn't just continue running. She stopped and tried to get help, which I would say Grace stopped to get help as well, but Grace didn't have Mrs. Swift tell her to not stop until she gets to the airport. For that, I think I will have to give Evie a 3.8, but I feel like that's at that point I might as well just give her a 4. I'll just give her a 4. Maybe I'm being too generous, but you guys can put yours in the comments. Next is wit. As for wit, I would say after the initial incident and the exit tactic, wit is the things that they do to make their exit. And for Grace, I would say she uses a lot of wit from the beginning. After getting out of the dumbwaiter, after finding out, she puts on her shoes and she's able to escape being literally pew-pewed at almost at point blank. Right? Emily was almost directly in front of her when she did it. And then she's able to make it to the kitchen, fast thinking, use a teapot to scold Mr. Stevens to make a break for it. And then once she gets outside, even though she ends up like scratching the mess out of her back, she is still able to make it through that fence. She's able to choke that man out. She's able to get into that car, and she would have been able to escape in that car if it didn't shut down, but she's able to keep fighting and crash the car. I would say that trying to plead with Daniel for a second time after the first time he already showed you argue that he was failing you and that he wasn't the right person to plead to, I will have to deduct points for that, because in the initial scene, you pleaded with him and he said, I'm going to give you a 10-second head start. So me personally, I'm not banking on that man again. He's already showed me he's not going to help me. But that's what inevitably ends up getting her caught again. That isn't to say that like she wasn't going to get caught in the first place, because if Daniel found her, Tony was there as well. He was hiding behind a tree because he had sent Daniel to be like the kind of catcher without force type of person. So that isn't to say she wouldn't have gotten caught if she had tried to run, because there was two people already there to catch her and that was their goal in the first place. But stopping to try and reason with Daniel didn't help that, if you get what I'm saying. But I will give her wit for making it so that the dagger went into her shoulder instead of here, because I mean that's a keep fighting move. And then taking it out and using it as your weapon, trying to fend off these people, I would have to give you some extra wit points for that as well. So I would say that's a 5 again. And I think I would also, sorry, I don't want to scare again too close. I would also have to give Evie a 5 as well. And I say that because, again, I had started to talk about it last time. Her quick thinking to save Dee, and then getting under the table in the icebox and making it to the village. Again, I already took off points during the ET section for her stopping in the village, so I can't take off points again for that. But I will say she does do some quick thinking. Once she sees that picture, like Grace, she scolds the man in the face with hot water. Well, it's hot tea, but same difference. For Grace, it was in a teapot. For her, it was in a teacup. But that's quick thinking to use the things you have around you. And she didn't drink the liquid. She was holding it. She never drank it. They kept on insisting and she did not drink it. She, unfortunately, same thing in that situation that could have happened to Grace. She was just caught again. But it was good for her to try and play along at that point so that she could inevitably make her escape. Like, she knew that by drinking his blood she was going to be able to gain her strength, and so she knew that would be her perfect opportunity to be able to escape. And so her drinking the blood and then going like she's about to go drink D and then freeing her so that both of them can get free and get out of the situation, that's amazing thinking. And then also grabbing the weapon from the one room when she was fighting Mr. Fields because she knew she'd probably need it later, that's smart thinking. And then using it to cut off his hand and then throwing him in the fire, smart. So I'm also going to give her a 5 for that. And then the final resolution of the film, for Grace's final resolution, she just simply sits on the steps. I completely understand, after a entire night of having to fend for your life, what do you want to do? Sit on the steps and smoke a cigarette. But still, if I'm comparing it to Evie's, I would have to give Grace a 3 and I'd have to give Evie a 5. And the reason I give Evie a 5 is that after escaping and getting home, her next initial thing was to go after the man who put her in that situation in the first place, Oliver. She didn't stop. She went home and she was a new person. Her friend makes a comment saying, like, I love this new Evie that I'm seeing. The situation gave her a lot more confidence. Now, you could argue that, like, there was nothing after that for Grace. The entire family was gone, so she didn't have to put in that extra work to get rid of them. And I mean, it's also the movie makers' choices to stop Grace's story where they did and continue Evie's where they didn't continue Grace's. But still, I'm just going based off of what I'm seeing on the screen, and I'm gonna give Evie a 4 for being able to continue after that. And now I'm gonna give out special points. For Grace, I'm going to give her 1 point for punching a child in the face. Let me explain. The reasoning I'm doing this is because she had the balls to do it, right? Like, to remind you, the child pew-pewed her through the hand. Even after that, I don't know if I would still have the balls to punch my perpetrator. I'm never going to be in that situation, but I'm saying I don't know if I would have done that, but she has had the balls to do that. So I gave her a point for it. I'm also going to give her a point for thinking quickly and calling the police. I don't know how to work other people's cars, so I don't know if this is just me. Like, every time I am put in a situation where I have to drive someone else's car, I don't like it. So her being able to get into a car she doesn't know, press the right buttons to be able to call the police, I'm giving her a point for that, even though the car did inevitably stop on her. I'm also going to give her a point for not feeling sympathy or having a soft spot for Alex once he proved he could turn on her. She was with him until he turned on her. And I'm just going to give her 1 point for, being able to stand on business the minute that Alex was willing to put that dagger in her chest. For Evie, I'm gonna give her a point for confronting Walt and not letting any of the racist comments that any of these people were making towards her slide, because they were definitely microaggressions. They were definitely subtle racist comments, and she didn't just take any of them. She confronted Walt, was like, "You're looking at my criminal record." She also spit in his face when he thought that she should feel fortunate for the position he was putting her in against her will. And when Victoria was making comments like that, she also always didn't take Victoria's BS. She always talked back to her, which was not something that Lucy, I guess, felt comfortable doing. But she never took any of the BS from any of those people. She was always like on her stuff. And I'm giving her a point for that throughout the entire movie. I'm also going to give her a point for having a safety plan with her friend, right? Like throughout the movie, there are moments where her friend is like checking in on her and she is texting her friend back. And then again, the safety plan I went over at the beginning of the movie when it happened, like I'm giving her a point for that, because that, being a woman traveling alone in the world, that is an important thing to have, and she had it. Lastly, I'm gonna give her a plus 0.5, because I just feel like this isn't enough to reward a full point, but I'll give her a plus 0.5 for snooping. Because if she hadn't snooped, if she hadn't snooped into that office and gotten that paper, she would have been completely clueless to the end. Now, when she got that information, she didn't make the right decision, but if she didn't snoop, she would have been clueless throughout the entire thing. So I'm going to give her a plus 0.5 for snooping to be able to find information she wouldn't have had if she didn't. And then I'm going to give them both a plus 20. Both of them a plus 20 for being women who escaped for their lives. I don't think I need to explain that more. Now I'm going to do this math and tally up, and we'll see who ends up being the winner out of the both of these women. So I just did the math, and I didn't do this on purpose. When I was looking at these results, I was like, it's too hard to tell. I don't know, because I gave them different ranks in each category, but they both different ways ended up with 41 points. I'm gonna show you to show you that I'm literally not joking. Here is my math I was doing here in each category if you want to see. And as you can see, they both ended up with 41 points. Again, I didn't do that on purpose. I swear, I didn't do it on That's crazy. I'm not going to try to change it because I wanted it to be fair. I wanted it to be completely fair as to just see who won, right? I didn't rig this, or I wasn't doing the mental math in my head or nothing like that. I was giving them points based on how I truly felt. They both just ended up with 41 points. Honestly, I'm impressed that kind of happened. So I guess that just kind of tells us that they're both bad biddies and both those movies are good. So if you've never seen them, I would completely recommend watching them. But yeah, please tell me who you would have put at the top. Clearly my brain says they both deserve their flowers evenly. But thank you so much for watching this video. Like if you like, subscribe if you want to see more of me. I don't know if this video is going out Wednesday or Thursday, but I do try to post every Wednesday. If I don't and it's one of these videos, it's just simply because these take me so long to edit, so they end up possibly going out a day late. But I hope you have a good weekend, weekday, weeknight, whenever. And I do have an Instagram. I don't post on my Instagram as much, but I do also have a TikTok. I post on there a bit more, but regardless, I do have those, and those are all linked in the description if you want to go and check those out. And bye.